Hello everyone. For this video, I want to talk about grammar. I want to try to answer some of your questions. What I'm going to do, since I'm recording this video on Friday the 19th, and I'm going to post this video and some of the sheets that I'm going to talk about here. I'm going to post them under week 9 originally today, and for over the weekend, just in case anybody logs on, so that they can see them. But then once next week starts, I'm going to move them over to week 10. So I don't know. Maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe I don't need to say that, but just so we know where this stuff's going to be, because I'm going to post a couple of grammar things. Well, you can't really see them here. Just a couple of like handouts, printouts that I created. One of them was scans from a handbook, a grammar handbook that I have. And I'm going to be referencing those throughout the video, so you might want to look at those or have them in front of you while you're watching this so it makes more sense. But yeah, let's get into it. So I'm going to save your questions for last, because I want to go through these handouts, and I'll probably answer most of the questions just by going through these. So the first one I'm looking at here, I'm going to post on Moodle called comma splices. So this one, it really has to do with run-on sentences and a specific kind of run-on sentence. What I've noticed since I've been teaching is that the kind of run-on sentence I see the most is one where we just kind of use a comma to keep a sentence going instead of like either ending the sentence or using the word and or something like that. I think we do this because of texting. Because, in texting, we never want to use a period, like we talked about in that how the internet has changed the language essay from weeks ago. If you use a period when you're texting, everyone's going to think you're mad at them, right? So we just kind of split up our ideas with commas when we're texting or on the internet and stuff. And that's fine for that, but if you're doing that on an essay, and if you have a professor who's like, really being a jerk about grammar, that can become a problem. So I think what we see is run-on sentences where we're kind of using commas to split up our thoughts, and you can call that a comma splice. So that's what this little reading is about. Like it says, a comma splice is a sentence in which only a comma is used to separate what could be two separate sentences. So that's really the main thing here, is realizing when something could be its own sentence. So for instance, they give this example here, and again, you guys can follow along. But it says, Snow White arrived late, comma, she has a bad habit of being tardy. So this doesn't work with the comma just in the middle there, because Snow White arrived late. That could be a sentence. And then the other part of it, she has a bad habit of being tardy. That could also be a sentence. So anything that's like a full thought that could stand on its own, they call that an independent clause. And all that means is that it could be its own sentence if we wanted to put a comma there. But sometimes we have reasons that we want to join things together because, it's on the same topic, or we just want to make our sentences more interesting and not so short. But we can't just separate it with a comma. Some other examples that they give here, and again, I'm going to post this, so I would try to follow along. This is on the comma splices document. So they say here at the bottom of the second page, they give an example. It says, fish travel in schools, comma, whales travel in pods. Again, you can't just use a comma to split this up, because fish travel in schools could be its own sentence, and whales travel in pods could be its own sentence. So you could say fish travel in schools and whales travel in pods, and you wouldn't need a comma, or you could use the word but or something like that. Or you could just make it two separate sentences. Fish travel in schools, period. Whales travel in pods, period. So the big thing with run-on sentences, if this is something that professors have taken points off on your essays or something people keep talking about to you, one of the big problems, I think, is when we try to use only a comma to join together what could be two separate sentences. What you can do instead is either make them two separate sentences or add in the word and or the word but or yet or one of those kind of connector words with the comma. So you can go through this whole thing and it gives a few more examples. But yeah, this is something that I would try to do in the editing process. So I wouldn't worry about this when you're first trying to write a draft and stuff. I would write your draft, do your revisions, And then at the end, I would just kind of go in and see how long your sentences are. Some other things to look for: if you have a sentence that's more than like 4 lines long, there's probably a way to split it up. And again, just ask yourself, is there any way that I could break this up? Could any of these things be their own sentence? Like, what if I put the period here? Could that be its own sentence? Um, and then we can avoid doing these kind of run-on sentences. Also, if you're using the word and or the word but like multiple times in one sentence, then there's probably a way to split it up. I would say that students, it's a bigger problem to have run-on sentences than to have sentences that are too short. So if you ever feel like it's just getting like really long, I would look for a way to split it up and see if you can. Okay, so yeah, and I would look through the rest of those examples there, but they're all on the same thing of using a comma. The split up could be two separate sentences. So that's the comma splices one. Now I want to go over to the other reading handout that I posted, which I'm going to be calling grammar explanations that'll be posted on Moodle. So again, I feel like a lot of this stuff works better with looking at the examples, So I would just go through and read through all of this, but I'll just go through some of the examples here, and just to give you a sense. So the first thing I have here is kind of a list of like 6 different instances when you want to use commas. And I would say if you can get used to like these specific rules that I have listed here, you'll eliminate like 90% of your comma errors. There are other rules. There's other like strange, weird rules that aren't listed here, but those just don't come up very often. And that's honestly the thing with a lot of grammar stuff. Like maybe I'll try to talk about this since people asked about it, but I had people asking about using semicolons. And the quick answer to that is you could get away with just never using one. I'll tell you how to use one towards the end of this video, but you don't really have to either. You can get away colons, semicolons. You can get away with just not using this stuff. Sometimes it's cool. Sometimes it can make our writing more interesting, or just to say it the way we want to say it. But you could get away with just never using them. Okay, so some of the different comma rules here. The first one I have, it says an opening phrase. This is when you start a sentence with a word like however. Like the example I give, however, some people are not so sure about this. You would go comma after however. So there's like a certain set of phrases that you use as like an opening word. It's kind of like a transition type word, like in a sentence, like however, where the reason we start a sentence with the word however is because we're like contrasting what we're saying now with what came before it. So like, however, the other example I give is on the other hand, some people are not so sure about this. And the comma would go, after on the other hand. There's other words like although gets used like this sometimes. Like if you said although I'm not so sure about this, then the comma would go after although. But then if you said like although I'm not sure about this, I'm going to do it anyway. In that case, the comma would go in the middle of the sentence after I'm not so sure about this. But yeah, so there's opening phrases like that. You can look at those examples. Here's another one. It's called a non-essential clause, and this is basically when we like have something in a sentence. We have like a phrase in a sentence that could be removed and the sentence would make sense without it. But for whatever reason we want to include it. It's important information, it adds to it. So like the example I gave here, I said my mom, comma, who loves movies, comma, is coming over today. So the reason that you use the 2 commas like there is because who loves movies is a non-essential clause. So we could say my mom is coming over today and that would work. But we want to add in this extra part because whatever, it's just I felt it was important to let you know that she likes movies, right? So since it's non-essential, you could remove it and the sentence would still work. You set it off with comma kind of on both sides there. The next one I have is lists. I think we know how that works. When you have a list of more than 2 things, you use the comma. Leading into a quote, this is a good one, especially if we're using quotes in our essays. If you have a phrase before the quote, like the author writes, or this character says, or somebody explains, if you introduce it with a verb like that, you always want to have a comma after that verb before the quote starts. So like I have here, the author writes, comma, and then the author wrote, I am a dumb idiot, is what I had the author write here in my example. Yeah. Calling someone by name, I don't even know why I included that one. That one's not too important. That's not something that really happens much with our writing. Okay, and then this one I just called like putting it in the middle of the sentence, and there's probably a more technical name for this, but that just made sense to me. So the example I give here, it says, if you are going to the store, comma, pick up some milk. Any sentence that starts with the word if is going to need a comma when it shifts from like if this, then this. There's always going to be a point kind of in the middle there where you need the comma. Another example I gave was, I would go to the store, comma, but I am too tired. So using the word but, you almost always need a comma before the word but. But that's if it could be both its own sentence on each side is the thing. Like, I am too tired could be its own sentence. I would go to the store could be its own sentence. Um, so for that reason, I have the comma, but, and then it links those two things together, and that works. So you also have these times when you use the comma in the middle of the sentence. Another thing that people asked about, and again, if you can just get down with those few comma rules, I think that'll fix most of your problems with commas. Another thing people asked about that I did have written here was the titles of things. And, this is something you might have seen on your literary analysis rough draft, if you handed that in. That, since what we're writing about there is a short story and not like a full length book, we use quotation marks, right? So basically, the way that this works, and again, you should follow along. I have the list here of which titles get italicized, which ones get quotation marks. But the basic thing here is that if it's like the largest version of the thing, it gets italics, and if it's like a smaller unit that goes inside of something else, it gets quotation marks. So like the chapter of a book gets quotation marks, but the name of the book gets italics. A short story gets quotation marks because it goes inside of a book of short stories with like 10 short stories in it, right? And the name of the book would get the italics. Um, so essays, like an essay or an article that you might use as an outside source, that gets quotation marks because usually that would appear inside of a journal or a magazine, and that would be the thing to get the italics. Also, movies, novels, newspapers, academic journals all get italics because there's kind of smaller things that fit in there, right? Like an academic journal has essays inside of it. The essays get quotation marks. The journal gets italics. So there you go. That's how that works. Just something that we have to get used to. Um, I gave you some stuff about colons at the end here. Again, you could get away with just never using a colon, but there's basically two main ways that we use colons. So one of them is introducing a list. So I gave an example here on the last page of this document. It says there are 3 things I need from the store: colon, apples, I think it's supposed to say beer, and bleach. So really the time we use a colon is when you like set up what you're about to say that way. There are 3 things I need from the store, and then you're going to give me the list, right? So whenever you frame it and phrase it in that kind of way, where you're like setting up the next thing you're going to say, you use a colon. Like the other example that I gave, this one's more adding emphasis, but I put, there was only one thing standing in Batman's way, colon, the Joker. So it's because of the specific phrasing of like setting up that last thing. Like if you said like, I saw something really scary at the mall, a giant rat. Same thing, colon, I saw something scary at the mall, colon, a giant rat. It's because you're kind of setting up the next thing. So that's how you use a colon. And then the semicolon, since people asked about it, basically a semicolon, so I was talking before with the comma splices about having like what could be its own sentence, what could stand alone as its own sentence. If you have like 2 things that could be their own sentences, but they're related to each other for some reason, one way you can stick them together is just by putting a semicolon in the middle. So the thing with a semicolon is that the thing on each side of the semicolon needs to be an independent clause, meaning that on each side of the semicolon you have to have what could be its own sentence. It could grammatically be its own sentence if we wanted it to, but they're like related to each other or something, so we want to stick them together. It's basically instead of using like a comma and the word and or the word but or whatever, you can just stick them together with a semicolon. Again, you could avoid using that and kind of be fine. But that's how they work. All right, so let me go through your questions and see which ones I did not answer yet. We talked about run-on sentences. Okay, somebody said, when using quotations, do you put the author's name in the bracket? I assume this person is talking about the citation that comes after you quote something. So in my video on research citations, I talked about how when you use a quote from an essay or from a story or whatever, you give the quote and then after it you have your in-text citation, right? Which is parentheses, author's last name, page number, close parentheses, period. So yeah, if that's what you're talking about with the parenthetical citation that comes after quote, yep, the author's last name, not the author's full name, only their last name goes in there. Okay, someone else said, what do we need to do to have a correct works cited page at the end of an essay? Good question. So I would go back and look at the MLA sample paper that I posted, I think under last week. Um, and if you go all the way to the end of that, you can see a correctly formatted works cited page. And so the basic things, we have works cited at the top, centered at the top of the page. And then to create the actual citations, like I said, you can go back and watch my video on citations. But I would say you guys could use like those generators. There's one on the Purdue OWL site that I posted a link to, where you can kind of just paste in the URL of the website or type in the name of the book, and they can like search it up and find like the publisher and where it was published and all this stuff. You can find the actual rules as well on the Purdue OWL site, but it's like, the author's last name, comma, their first name, the title of the book italicized, where it was published. So it's just a lot of stuff. So I would be fine with using one of those generators and just kind of checking it against examples and checking it against the rules that are on there to make sure you're doing it right. And then, like I also think I said in the other video, when you do the citation on the works cited page, like you'll see, they have like the every line after the first one, if it's like a 4 pages or sorry, 4 lines of the citation, everyone after the first one gets like indented, so you can see it all goes back to like that original one. And then I guess you're also supposed to put them in alphabetical order. I don't really care about that, but if you're trying to do it the right way, you would have them in alphabetical order by the first letter that appears in the citation, and you'd have them listed by that, and there you go, works cited page. Okay, so someone asked, they said, do we have to write an original quote or should we fix some grammatical mistakes in the original quote? If you're quoting for something, you quote it exactly as it is. If you want to like change it so that it fits in with the sentence that you're making, what you can do is put in brackets, so like if you're quoting something and I don't know, it's hard to think of an example. It uses like it doesn't include someone's name. Okay, so say you're quoting something and the quote just says his, but because of how you're writing it in your essay, you want it to include the name of the person, right? Instead of just saying his. What you can do is put the person's name in brackets, put it inside of the quote, put it in brackets, not parentheses, more like the square type parentheses, You can put it in brackets, put the person's name, and then give us the rest of the regular quote. And because it's in brackets, we'll know that that's not what was in the actual quote, but that you're just kind of clarifying so that's easier for us to understand. But in general, you should keep the quote the way that it is. By quoting it, that means that you're pulling it kind of exactly how it is, unless you put something in brackets, or if you skip some stuff, you can do an ellipses, and you can skip over stuff that's unimportant kind of in the middle of the quote. So those are kind of the only ways that you want to change it. This was kind of an interesting question. Someone asked, does grammar set the tone for any paper? I guess it does in a way. One thing that I always tell students about grammar and like specifically about typos, because for me, like the stuff about commas, like it's whatever. I'm not all that worried about it. Run-on sentences, those can be can kind of throw a reader off if you have a sentence that's like way too long. So I do kind of care about those, but the thing to me about grammar is like I personally don't like seeing typos in a student's paper. It takes your attention away from what's being said. Like if they're just missing a word, or if they have the word the and it's supposed to be they, or like if they don't have a capital letter or something like that. I'm not like I don't view those things as like an affront to academics or something. Like I'm not going to be ridiculous about it. But I do think that if there are like typos in your paper, it does kind of I try to fight against this because I think it's silly, but it does kind of send a message to the professor that you didn't maybe take as much time looking it over as you should, or that maybe you didn't put in as much effort as you could have. Because if there's typos in a paper, that just means that you didn't read it over closely enough. And we talked about this. I think I did a video on proofreading where I told you guys, to try to print it out or read it out loud or have someone else read through it and that kind of stuff. But for me, I would just try to if there are a bunch of typos in your paper, I do think that kind of gives might make the professor think that you didn't put in your best effort or spend enough time on it. So I guess in that way we could say that it sets the tone. But in general, you guys know how I feel about grammar. I just don't think it's all that important. When we're talking about what makes a good essay, I just think grammar is pretty low on that list. Somebody asked, what are split infinitives? I honestly don't know. I considered looking this up, and I was like, you know what? If I just have never even heard of the thing, it's probably not something you need necessarily. I don't know. If this is something that you've been hearing from another professor or is like super confusing for you, send me an email and I'll, I can dig it up and try to see what's good with that. But I know an infinitive is like the base form of a verb, like to run or whatever would be the base form of like run. So I know that that's what an infinitive is. But I'm honestly not totally sure, and that makes me feel like you probably don't need to know that. But if like another professor talked to you about that, or you're getting comments back on a paper that's like that, send me an email and I'll try to help you out. Underlies. Okay, so here are some other questions. These are kind of hyper specific. I'll try to give some examples if I can. This might be tough though. So somebody asked, when should I use few versus a few? If you gave me some examples, this would be easier for me to work with. I'm trying to think of, so obviously we'd be like, okay, I have a few things to do later, but maybe we'd say like there are a few reasons that somebody would do something. Honestly, I think some of these things that this person asked are kind of more stylistic decisions that there's not really like a hard answer for. Because like a lot of things with English, like we like to pretend like there's hard and fast rules for everything, but a lot of the stuff is just kind of stylistic or like what you feel works better at the time. Like this person also asked about should we say if you have any questions or should we say should you have any questions? And that's a stylistic thing to me. I think they asked if you were writing in an email or something, and I think either of them is fine. I don't think one is like not fancy enough or something. I say in an email to students all the time, if you have any questions, reach out to me. I could also say, should you have any questions, reach out to me. It's kind of the same exact thing, but it's a stylistic difference. So I think either of those, they basically mean exactly the same thing. And this person asked about into as one word versus into as two words. Again, I think it's a stylistic thing. I went into the gym. I don't know. Does it have to be one word or two? I don't really think there's a hard and fast rule for that. I think it's kind of what you want. They also asked about toward versus towards. Like I'm moving towards my goal, or I'm trying to make progress toward a new car. Again, I think it's mostly a stylistic thing. I just was trying to think of an example where one of them like doesn't work. Like head towards Main Street and then make a right. Head toward Main Street and make a right. Those both seem fine to me. They also asked, where does the period go with quotation marks? So it depends what we're doing. When you're doing a citation, the period is supposed to, like if you're quoting from something in an essay, the period is supposed to go after the citation. So what you have in quotes, you just put words basically inside the quotes. End the quote, have your citation with the parentheses, and then the period at the end of that. And yeah, I guess that kind of answers the other part too. Somebody else asked out, when do you spell out a number? I've heard people say rules for this before. I don't know where they get this from. Like I've heard people say, oh, if it's over 20, you're supposed to spell it out, or if it's under 20 or something. I have never found a place that has a rule for that listed where that it's like the same rule everyone respects. I feel like that's more individual professors being insane, I guess is what I'd say. I think it's more your own personal level of psychopathy or something like that. How insane you are, I guess, determines what professors want with that. I don't have a good answer. I don't know when you're supposed to spell out a number and when you're supposed to put the number. I would say if you're concerned about it, if you feel like you have a professor who's like going to get mad about that or take points off, I would just always spell out the number. I think that's mostly what I do. If I'm trying to be like formal, I'll just write out the number. But I don't think there's really any like specific rule to go with there. All right, I think that's enough for grammar for now. If you have any other specific questions about this stuff, get in touch with me. I'll try to help you guys out. Like I've said, I don't think grammar is all that important to having a good essay. I think it's very low on the list of things that make a piece of writing good. But I know you might have to deal with it in future courses or the tests that we have to take for this class. So there's a little bit of info. If you can get down with the comma stuff, the run-on sentence stuff, I think that is the most important, the problems that students have the most often and the things that professors really kind of harp on. So I would focus on understanding the comma splice stuff and those rules that I gave you about commas. And hopefully that should be good. And again, the big thing for me is just not having any typos. So just make sure you proofread and try to get rid of all of those. Okay, that's it for now. Talk to you soon.